294,292 confirmed cases, where the active cases is 147,667. The recovery is sitting at 146,279. And there are those who lost their lives, and the number is sitting at 4,346. Honorable members, coronavirus is real. It kills. Let's take all the precautions. Let's wash our hands. Let's use water and soap. Let's sanitize. Let's wear masks all the times. Let's have social distancing. Let us all be responsible. Let's save lives. Honorable members and all the delegates, I think everyone has got a program in front where they did all the testing. Now we'll be starting with the moment of silence. Also remembering those who lost their lives because of the COVID-19, some because of gender-based violence, and some other illnesses. So let's have a moment of silence for a prayer and meditation. Amen. Honorable members, I think now we are going to receive a word of welcome. And the Deputy Chairperson of the NCOP, Honorable Lucas, is the one who is going to render the item. Thank you very much. Honorable Lucas, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, and good afternoon to the delegates and to all the participants in this very important session of today. Let me start with protocols and acknowledge the presence of the
item.
The presence of the
Thank you very much. Honorable Lucas,
Council
over
of Provinces.
to you. Thanks.
House members, Chairperson, and members of Parliament, delegates, and to all the participants in this very important session of today. Our commissioners, let me start with participants speaking English and acknowledge the presence. Like the Honorable Ilangru said, we are meeting amidst the pandemic currently globally to make sure that our people stay safe and that we preserve lives. This program is a pursuit of Parliament's constitutional mandate for the involvement of the public in its legislative and other processes. Sessions forms part of the review processes of the entire Women's Rights Review. The objective for us to embark on this process is to ensure Parliament exercises its authority through its committees to hold spheres of government accountable for implementing gender transformation. We further endeavor to build relations between various players in the national gender negative culture of working in silos. We are also seeking to initiate and promote cross-sectoral actions on cross-cutting issues such as gender-based violence and related matters. We also want to provide leadership in ensuring a gender equality and to fast-track response programs with clear indicators, baseline data, to facilitate the monitoring of gender wage inequality. Within the context of the 25-year review of the Women's Charter, we should also assess the number of women represented in decision-making positions in both the private and the public sectors. We must also deliberate on interventions we can put in place to address remaining inequalities. And the core to women's inequality is the patriarchal social ideology that places women in a subordinate position in relation to men. An important political manifestation of this patriarchal social ideology is women's limited access to economic empowerment, lack of gender mainstreaming and women empowerment as an approach has resulted in the perpetuation of gender inequality, while equity has been more about numbers rather than transformation through mainstreaming as a mechanism towards equality. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, the majority-led government of national unity in 1994 inherited a country where gender disparities were deep and women, particularly black women, faced many disadvantages and discriminations through apartheid, entrenched patriarchy, and lack of basic social services. The sector review process, together with the 1994 Women's and will culminate in the production of a live document which must articulate policy interventions, law reform processes, and improve systematic arrangements to improve the status of women in South Africa. Through this process, we seek to crystallize our focus and give guidance to apex priorities, which must underpin the attainment of gender equality. With that said, I wish to welcome all of you to this platform, to this discussion forum, and declare this meeting officially open. Let us be in conversation with Parliament so that we can transform not only the gender wage gap, but also the entrenched inequalities that is culminating from a patriarchal background and a society that is becoming more unequal as we are trying to where prosperity is there for all of us to enjoy. With that said, welcome to this platform and may we have fruitful deliberations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deputy Chairperson, for the warm welcoming. I know you that Women's Charters Review is the thing that you have passion on. You have that passion of making sure that women are not left behind. And I think today we're going to learn a lot during our deliberations. We are moving on, honorable members, delegates, and all participants to the second item. The second item, which is the statistics on gender pay gap in South Africa's transformational discourse. And that one is going to be rendered by the Statistician General of South Africa, who is Mr. R. Maluleke. And I think next time, Deputy Chairperson, the statistician will be a woman, because I do believe that women can be statisticians also. Thank you very much. Over to you, Mr. Maluleke.
Fortunately, this one still remember what his mother taught him.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. My father was a migrant worker, and all you see in me are the values that were engraved into me by my mother and my grandmother, and a host of a lot of grandmothers that were all there in the village. So when I was asked to take over the position of a statistician general, I said to Comrade Jeff Radebe, then our minister, my apologies, we are not in a political meeting, we are in a meeting of the honorables. I said to Minister Radebe, if it means that we have others, let us bring them on board. And indeed, I do take this matter very serious of making sure that the next statistician general should be a woman. It's just that it's beyond my control, but it's a matter we must work together because it sends the right message when we do that. And we should not sugarcoat it, we must just deal with it. Let me get my presentation loaded and deal with issues, because the numbers I'm about to show do speak to the fact that the emancipation of women is necessary. It's a must because the numbers show we have a gap. So let us get the presentation loaded. I don't have loading rights, so we will load it from that side. Let us go to the second slide, which talks about inputs out. Let's do a slideshow so that we can move faster. On the second slide that talks about inputs and outputs and process indicators, there's no slideshow. I need that. From my side, it's not showing. I don't know whether it's showing from your side, Chairperson.
It's not showing. It's not showing. I think it's the first page that has been shown here.
Yeah,
IT assist us.
The president promised, and I quote, an extraordinary health budget.
Hello.
R1 billion to fund the health response.
Kevin, please assist.
Where is this money? It's not in the budget.
Please assist us with a slide.
The president did not say that the central government will fund money themselves. The evidence is that the president misled the country when he made that.
Thanks, Kevin. Let's do the slideshow. Thanks. Yes.
Okay.
Can we put it on slideshow if possible? But otherwise, I'll start presenting. Let me also say, Chairperson, that let me note the Deputy Speaker, let me note the members of the NCOP, the commissioners, and indeed, let me note honorable members and say all protocols observed. There is some sound, Chairperson, in the background. I don't know whether you can hear it. Yeah, thanks. Now it's gone. In this slide where we are talking about indicators, we are talking about input, process, output, and outcomes indicators and impact. Stats SA usually focuses on outcomes, and I'll sketch it for purposes of those who want to understand the space of indicators. Let us look at the Department of Housing. The houses that are built, budgets, and people who work in there are indicators for input. The process of building as to how far we are a day is process indicators. And the number of houses that are built are output. And the number of people who move into those houses are outcomes. And the improvements in the life circumstances of such people then become impact. So that's how we look at the work of Stats SA. So official statistics usually looks at the space of output and outcomes, but the work of Stats SA is largely in the space of outcomes. And the whole area of impact is looked at by the Human Sciences Research Council and other agencies. Now, let us look at the next slide. The next slide tells us that the population of South Africa as of the 1st of July 2020 is 59.62 million persons. And amongst those people that are about 60 million, if we look at the next slide, we will see that women take a larger chunk. Women account for 51.1%, whereas men only account for 48.9%. And when we look at that, we can see that women are actually about 30.5 million and men are about 29.1 million, meaning that we have about a 1.4 million lead in favor of women. But this is not new. It has always been the case in South Africa and indeed all over the world. But not only that, when we look at all provinces in South Africa, with an exception of Gauteng, all the provinces have higher proportions of females, especially your rural provinces like your Limpopo, Eastern Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, whereas only Gauteng has a higher number of males. So you have about 51% in favor of men because of our migratory patterns in search of work, where men leave their homes and come and work in Gauteng. Now, let us look at labor markets. Let's skip the next slide and go to the next slide. When we look at this slide, perhaps before I talk about this slide, in the population of South Africa, Gauteng accounts for a larger chunk of the population. This slide is not here. Gauteng has about 15.5 million, whereas KwaZulu-Natal has about 11.53 million. And KwaZulu-Natal's, Limpopo has a population that is showing migratory patterns. So is KwaZulu-Natal, so is Eastern Cape and the like. But back to Gauteng. In Gauteng, it accounts for 26% of the population of our country. And it has overtaken KwaZulu-Natal. KwaZulu-Natal used to be the most populous province in 1996. 2001, it was overtaken by Gauteng. And from there on, Gauteng is making a gap because provinces like Limpopo are contributing more to Gauteng, followed by KwaZulu-Natal, followed by the Eastern Cape. And 50% of people who are coming from outside South Africa, they choose Gauteng as their destination. Now, let us look at labor markets. We are saying that in our country, let us skip to that slide that we are on now. Thanks. Now, go back to the previous slide. Thanks, Kevin. We are saying that in our country, we have about 38.9 million people aged 15 to 64 years who are called working age. There is this question, Chairperson. Why do we call young people of 15 years working age? The basic conditions of employment act is clear. It says it is illegal to hire anybody under the age of 15, meaning that anybody of 15 years and above can take up employment if for whatever reason they are not at school. So we don't include learners here. Those who are at school, we exclude them. They belong to your not economically active, and they account for 40% of the not economically active. Now, let us come back to this slide. Out of the 38.9 million of people who are aged 15 to 64 years, only 23.5 million persons are what we call the labor force. That is, they are either employed or unemployed. And out of those, 16.4 million persons are employed, 7.1 million persons are unemployed, and they account for our official headline figure of 30.1% that says the unemployment rate is 30.1%. We still have a set of people who are called the discouraged work seekers. Before I come to the discouraged work seekers, these 7.1 million people, Chair, are people who are looking for employment for 4 days a week, 4 weeks in a row. So they're actively looking for employment. Whereas the 2.9 million persons have looked for employment until they are discouraged and they are no longer looking. Now let us look at the next slide. In the next slide, we can see that the unemployment rate on the left-hand side is sitting at 30.1%, accounting exactly for those 7.1 million. But when we look at women, their unemployment rate is always higher than that of men. It's sitting at 32.4% versus that one of men sitting at 28.3%. Now, when we look at this 7.1 million, now we are moving to the right-hand side, and we add the discouraged work seeker, that is 2.9 million, plus another 800,000 who are in the not economically active, who for whatever reason, they didn't look for employment other than being discouraged, but if they got employment, they would have taken it. We come to 10.8 million. This 10.8 million represents what we call the expanded unemployment group, and they are sitting at 39.7%. But look at women. Women are even much more higher, 43.4%. So in every aspect of life, women are actually in a very, very adverse situation, be it employment or otherwise. But let us look at, when we talk about women, what are we talking about in relation to this unemployment? And we want to unpack it in relation to population groups so that we don't just leave it there. Let us go to the next slide. I would want to say that look at the labor participation, labor force participation rate of women. While indeed it increased from 2008 from 52, that is the line at the bottom, the lighter line, from 52.1% to 54.5%, it is still much more lower than that of males. When we talk about the labor force participation rate, we are talking about the proportion of women, people who are either employed or unemployed. So women, when it comes to forming part of the labor force, they are relatively lesser than men. And we can see that the percentage gap there is in the region of about 9 percentage points. And it has been consistently like that over a period of time. Let us look at the next slide. In the next slide, we are looking at unemployment both for males and females. And I want us to first look at unemployment in relation to population groups on the left-hand side. We can see that while our unemployment rate is sitting at 30.1%, the unemployment rate of different population groups is indicated just below. We can see that the unemployment rate of Black Africans is sitting at 33.8%, followed by coloreds at 24%, and the Indian Asians at 13%, and the lowest is that of the white population group. But let us go straight to females. On the right-hand side, the unemployment rate for women, of course, is higher, but being higher, then we come to that of Black African women. It's even higher than the national average. It's sitting at 36.5%. And when we compare it with the national average, which is 30.1% of all people included, then it's leading with more than almost 6.4 percentage points. And that is a bit higher. But when we look further, we can see that unemployment affects Black African women the most, followed by a colored population group the most, followed by the Indian Asians, and at the lowest are the white population group. Let me mention that in all aspects of life, the Indian population group, Indian Asian, is catching up with the white population group. And that's what the numbers are showing every day. Let us look at the next slide. In the next slide, we are looking at the expanded unemployment rate. The expanded unemployment rate, I just want us to focus on women again. When we look at women on the right-hand side, we can see that women actually are far much higher than men, sitting at 43.4% versus the males in the middle at 36.5%. But when we unpack them in population groups, the Black African women are still much more vulnerable to labor markets compared to the colored population group, and again, compared to the Indian Asian and compared to the white population group. Let us skip the next slide and go straight to the next one. Here we are talking about the need, what we call the not in employment, education, or training. And here we are saying, before we look at those who are not in employment, education, or training, we are saying that in South Africa, those aged 15 to 24 years, regardless of whether they are male or female, whether they are in employment or in education or what, they account for 10.3 million persons. Out of those, 3.5 million persons are not in employment, education, or training. And these are young people, 15 to 24 years, but it's even much worse for the females. Look at the females. They're actually much more higher. The lighter color, the pink color, is much more higher than that of males in relation to being not in employment, education, or training. And indeed, even when it was relatively lesser in 2019 first quarter, but it still remains higher than that of males. Let us skip the next slide and go straight to that slide. Perhaps let's go to the title of the slide above it so that I can contextualize it. Yeah, we want to talk about the gender pay gap in South Africa coming from the quarterly labor force survey. Let us look at the next slide. In the next slide, we are saying that in 2018, women's median monthly income were 76% of men's median monthly earnings. Let us look at this way. If men were earning 100 Rand, women were earning 76 Rand on average. That's what it means. That's what it means. Let us look at the next slide. In the next slide, we are saying that between 2013 and 2018, the gender pay gap generally narrowed, with a parity reached for employees between in the bottom 5%, and I will explain this. Let us look at the dotted line on the right-hand side. The dotted line going from top to bottom shows us the parity. That is when men and women are earning the same. And then now, any bar in a lighter color from the right-hand side, from the left-hand side, only the bar that is touching the dotted line tells us that women have reached a parity gap with men. Now, only the bottom 5%, those that earned the lowest, were actually catching up with men. But otherwise, all other groups, be it bottom 10, bottom 25%, top 25%, or top 5%, were falling short of reaching a parity with men. So what it says is that the people in the lowest rung of our social order in earnings are the ones that are equal in parity. But the more higher we grow, especially those that are in executive positions, women are not remunerated equally with men. That's what the statistics are showing. Now, while we can indicate that there was a bit of improvement between 2013 to 2018, say for the top 5%, moving by about 6 percentage points, that was still very small because it didn't achieve the parity. We can see for all groups, right on the towards the right-hand side, there is a dot indicating the percentages. There are improvements, but those improvements do not show much of reaching to parity, to the dotted line. And indeed, for the bottom 10, they even regressed backwards, where women in 2013 were earning more, but they dropped by 1 percentage point, going backwards in the bottom 10. Let's go to the next slide. In the next slide, we say that women with tertiary education experienced narrower pay gap in 2018, earning 92.3% of men's earnings. So let us look at the dotted line again from top to bottom on the right-hand side. Any line that is moving towards touching it or that touches it has reached the pay parity. But we can see that only women with tertiary education right at the top had reached 92.3% of men's earnings. But otherwise, all the others, especially those with less than primary school, had struggled. They were actually just earning about 53.3% of men's salaries. So if we look right at the bottom, it's 53.3%. So women with less than matric in 2018 only earned half of what men are earning. So this issue that we have raised previously, Chair, of education as a tool for the emancipation of women becomes critical, because we can see that only those with tertiary education had actually moved to catch up with men in relation to the parity gap. Let's deal with the next slide. In the next slide, we are showing them in terms of age groups, cohorts. We can see that only those that were younger, 15 to 24 at the bottom, were moving closer to the dotted line. But otherwise, any other age cohort, especially those aged 45 to 54, actually remained far from reaching a pay parity with men. And we will unpack further in other categories in the next slide. So let us look at the next slide. In the next slide, we are talking about population groups. Let us look at the dotted line again, and let us look which population group is moving closer. In terms of Indian Asians, the females there had actually caught up with the males in terms of the pay parity. Whereas for the whites, it was sitting at 94%, for coloreds, 84%, and 76% for your Black African group. So except for the Indian Asians population groups, the other population groups had not been able to catch up with the male pay parity. Let us look at the next slide. In the next slide, we are looking at them by province. Limpopo had the lowest, the highest pay gap between males and females, where females were earning 66.2% versus males. And we can see Limpopo right at the bottom with a darker line. It's far away from the dotted line on the right that moves from top to bottom. And only in the Western Cape did we see women earning a lot more closer to men, but still far below, sitting at 87%, followed by the Eastern Cape, followed by Gauteng. And let us look at the next slide again. In the next slide, we are looking at provinces as well as urban, rural, but also we are looking at population groups. Anywhere where we see a color that is looking like orange, it shows that we have a problem. We are looking at the parity there. And we can see, let us look in terms of provinces. Look at Limpopo. The highest numbers of of females versus men at lower bracket earnings. Let us look at that. When we look at the dotted colors in Limpopo, they show us a lot more problems, as well as amongst the Black, African, and the colored population group. But amongst the white and the Indian population, we had lesser problems. And we can see that this happens a lot more amongst people in lower brackets of payment, of income or earnings. And that's where we see it, that in every province, it's showing, with an exception of Gauteng and the Western Cape. But otherwise, all the provinces, and much more prevalent in Limpopo, Mpumalanga, and of course in KZN. So we can say that indeed, these are much more challenges that we are seeing in relation to province versus issues of Black, African, as well as Indian, Asian, white, and the colors. Let's look at the next slide. The next slide, Chair, and I think having followed these meetings throughout when we were focusing on the Northern Cape, I must admit that we have presented at StatsSA a lot more of a variety of statistics. Some of them are not yet ready to be disaggregated at gender levels owing to our lower sample sizes. And some of them are not disaggregated at provincial level owing to our smaller sample sizes. But let us look. We provide statistics in relation to government. Could it be services in relation to tertiary institution, national government, local government, the economy, GDP, CPI, PPI? As you are aware, we have released the CPI, and again, we will be releasing the PPI tomorrow. And in society, we are talking about living conditions survey. We are looking at employment, unemployment, population. We're looking at media estimates. And of course, we've just released media estimates. And furthermore, crime and justice, we are looking at governance, public safety, and justice, and in environment, agriculture, ecosystem. So what we say, Chairperson, is that we follow people from birth to death. When they are born, we are there. We tell South Africans that as of 21st July, coming out of 2019 1st July, there were 1.17 million children born. We can tell how many children are at school. So when people start school, we are there. StatsSA will come and tell South Africans how many people are at school in primary, secondary education, as well as in tertiary. When they leave school and go and work, we are there. We have to tell South Africans what, where they work, whether they work or unemployed, what they earn. And indeed, when they get married, we are there because we have to tell South Africans how many people are married, whether it's customary, civil, or otherwise. And unfortunately, while we don't want that, Chairperson, when they divorce, we are there. We have to tell South Africans how many people have divorced and the reasons and who initiated the divorce, whether it's the wife or the husband. We have to tell South Africans. When they start a business and they run an industry, we are there. We have to tell South Africans the size of the economy, how it's at what pace it's growing. And when indeed they spend, we are there to talk about what is the consumer price index. And finally, when they die, we may not know when one day we are no more, that Stats SA will be there. Because Stats SA always has to explain to the public what has taken the lives of South Africans. When they leave South Africa, for whatever reason, migrate, we are there. When they come into South Africa, and those who are born outside, we are there. We'll explain to South Africans how many people have come in. The next slide, Chairperson. I've spoken at the beginning about the fact that my father was a migrant worker. Our parents, and not mine alone, generally all over the country in rural provinces where migratory patterns were higher, our mothers used to write letters to our fathers. Our mothers, the majority of them were illiterate. And when they write letters, they didn't want us, Chairperson, to conclude their letters like, I miss you, my husband, or I love you, because children were not supposed to hear those kinds of words. They would go deaf. If they saw those kinds of words or they wrote them down, they would go blind. If we wrote with our with our hands those kinds of words, our hands would no longer write in future. So every mother would conclude a letter with a standard sentence, Ndihela kwala. When she has finished telling the husband everything, it was Ndihela kwala, meaning that I finish here. Ndiceda khona lapha, ndiyaceda khona apha. That's how it was ended. And never, Chairperson, never again should we allow a section of the society, be it young people or otherwise, but in particular women, not to be able to express themselves in full or to reach their full potential, that even when they want to say something to their own loved ones, they have to use other words than say what it is. And it starts here in these kinds of discussions, Chairperson. Let us look at the next slide. It looks like the next slide is blank, Chairperson. I thank you.
No, thank you very much. Shandla, enhla ka xin'wana Shandla, Tatani Maluleke. Hayi xi vele tindleveni. No pfumela ku lava vo ndzi hela kwala a va nga ha endli va ta swi tiva ku a swi fanelanga ku va swi vula va fanele va vula leswi nga ndzeni ka timbilu ta vona. Hi khense ngopfu, ni khense swinene. Thank you very much, honorable members and everyone else, participants and also delegates. We are moving on after receiving the statistics by our statistician, Mr. Maluleke. I've learned a lot today. I've learned a lot. But that gender pay parity should be looked at, especially when it comes to provinces. I'm from Limpopo. I'm so worried if Limpopo is the last province when it comes to gender pay parity. I think we need to discuss that. I will challenge Honorable Premier Mathabat here in Limpopo to say they must look into that one. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Honorable members, we are moving on to the next item. And the next item will be women's representation in the public service entry level, middle management and senior management level. And that one will be rendered by the commissioner, Ms. P. Zimande. Ms. Zimande.
Good afternoon, Chairperson, honorable members and fellow participants. Am I audible, Chair?
You are audible, you are audible.
Very
and
much.
Good afternoon to you too.
Good afternoon. Kevin will help me there by feeding the presentation. And while Kevin is doing so, Chairperson, go straight to slide 3, Kevin. Slide 2. While Kevin is helping us, Chairperson, just to appreciate that we were invited as the Public Service Commission. We are the only institution that is established in terms of Chapter 10 of the Constitution. I need not state that, especially in this very august house that has made that possible. But I'm just stating it for the purposes of those who are listening and viewing this session. Chairperson, as just before I start my presentation, as we are listening to the statistician general, it is quite tempting, especially in a journey of transformation like this, of gender transformation, to measure ourselves by the height we've yet to reach, rather than the distance we've already traveled. So I think that it is important to really appreciate what Parliament is doing here, reviewing 25 years on, because we need to keep that balance going, that as we aspire to go to greater heights in terms of closing this gender gap, in terms of addressing the inequalities based on gender in our society, but also to appreciate the long way we have come from. Just by an anecdote, Chairperson, in 1985, when I was a young, happening professional training nurses in one of the of then reputable nursing colleges, recently, hardly a year married, in the middle of a lecture teaching first-year students, I got a call from the matron of that hospital to come and see her urgently. And I asked my colleagues to inform the matron that I was in the middle of a lecture. And lo and behold, the message was, the matron is looking for you now. At that time, as a newlywed, I didn't even have a car of my own. My husband dropped me in the morning at work. And the only reason I could think of that she could disrupt my lecture was that, oh my God, just before even the year end, my poor new husband must have been run over by a car, because it was so abrupt, it was so forceful, I had to drop everything and go. Got there, and she told me, I believe you are pregnant, and you know the policy. The policy then in 1985, honorable members, as most of you would know, will remember, was that as health professionals, we did not have maternity leave. If you fell pregnant, you had to resign. After giving birth, if you were lucky, you had to reapply and start from the beginning. But the majority of health professionals, the option I didn't have, those who were working on the wards, they would have to ask for night duty and work at night so that nobody recognizes that they are pregnant. Ask for a friendly doctor they know to induce labor when labor came, so that they could give labor over the weekend, so that on a Monday, week and all, are back at work, so that they could continue to fend for their families. Now, the moral of that anecdote is that as we review the Women's Charter for Effective Equality, with so much still happening in our society, which is challenging us, that we've yet to reach the height we aspire, including the representativity figures in terms of pay gap that we've just had. Let us remember that we've come a long way. My daughter now, who's recently married, who's younger than my son that I was carried then, is gonna be able to enjoy 6 months paid leave. So many years later, will be treated with dignity like a human being that she deserves to be. So as we review the Women's Charter, I think we are also have to review all of our journeys that we have come along, that we are reviewing the Women's Charter for Effective Equality, but so are we also reviewing our own contribution to making sure that it's not just a document, but it is a roadmap or a GPS that allows us all to rally and make and improve the lives of both men and women and girls and boys in our society. That said, Chairperson, we've been asked as the Commission, as the Public Service Commission, to share with this august House the journey of how women are represented in the public service, moving from that global picture of the SG, the conditions that enable women to adequately participate in public service, challenges pertaining to gender transformation in the public service, interventions that we as a commission have put in place to contribute in the workplace, and the role of the public service in ensuring that it helps to foster a healthy and a safer working environment. Next slide. The journey from that mobilization of women, especially at the dawn of our democracy, mapping out the Women's Charter, made it possible for the constitution that we have today to have the foundation for gender transformation through the founding values and principles such as human dignity, equality, and non-sexism. Simply put, the gender-sensitive highest law of the land that we see today didn't just happen. It was the mobilization, and it was a clear vision, clear program that was articulated by women from all walks of life that made it possible for us to have the highest law of the land that we have today. Behind the constitutional imperative then was actually, through Women's Charter for Effective Equality, that program for equality in all spheres of public and private life. I have put that graphic representation of the founding values of the Constitution, as well as those maroon spots, which are 9 of them, the principles that underpin the public service, right up front deliberately, because as the Public Service Commission, in terms of Section 195 of the Constitution, our sole reason for existence is to promote these founding values and principles in the public service, so as to ensure that the services that are rendered by the public service are in line with these principles. The workplace called the public service is in line with these principles. The conduct of officials and everybody is in line with these principles. When anything falters in the public service, you can point it back to the extent to which the founding values of equality, of non-sexism, of supremacy of the law have been ignored. So I thought I should put this up front, because whether you're talking about how you're promoting and dealing with issues of toxic masculinity, it's only because those values have been ignored. Next slide. In respect then of the issues that we've been asked to talk specifically about, which is representation, flowing from the Constitution, government has put in place measures such as the Employment Equity Act, number 55 of 1998, as amended, to enable the equitable representation of women in the workplace. As you know, honorable members, this is not something that you arrive at. It is something that is a daily struggle to make sure that it is realized. You will see when I show you the next slides how the picture of that journey pans out in the various levels of seniority in government. In 1995, Cabinet set out various employment equity targets. In 2005, these targets for women representation in senior management level was revised from 30% to 50%. The Public Service Commission then monitors on a regular basis the extent to which the constitutional values and principles governing public administration are complied, including this main principle of representativity. Next slide. That is the picture, honorable members, from entry, middle management, and senior management levels. I'm not going to bore you in detail in terms of going line by line, but you will see, for example, that at entry levels, the participation of women is quite high vis-a-vis that of males. You will understand, of course, that it's largely because at that entry level, the majority of women are just entering in. They are young. Many of them have come from university. They have not yet committed in terms of the various areas of their lives, starting families and all that, and they are raring to participate. As you go to middle level, you will see that the figures are beginning to change. By the time you go to senior management level, look at that entry from 62% to the red that I've highlighted, which is now 43%. You could argue that maybe it's largely just what is happening in the workspace. But on the other side, it is both a societal matter as well as a workspace matter. Many of the women get constrained because society, while we open the opportunities for women to rise, things have not really changed at a societal level. As women start commitments, families, and everything, they have their responsibilities to shine and be senior levels participants. But at the level of society, they still have to carry that burden of gender inequalities in society. Next slide. But also, it is also about certain other sectors which remain predominantly male, like in the areas of engineering and law and those other areas. So you find that it's not quite easy for women to be represented in certain sectors, largely because males have tended to dominate in those areas. So if you look then at the conditions that enable women to adequately participate in the public service, going back to 2007, where the Minister of Public Service and Administration realized that if we don't put some kind of a roadmap internally, which was called then 8 Principle Action Plan for promoting women's empowerment and gender equality, it was quite clear that unless this is mainstreamed in each and every department, such that it's not seen as just a recruitment problem that you bring all of these women in the public service, but it becomes the responsibility, particularly at a director general level, to have first of all, even in the performance contracting, in the performance contract of the director general, you must put an indicator, and indicators the extent to which each and every government department actually lives and is guided by these 8 principles. One of them, transformation for non-citizen, promoting and protecting human dignity and human rights of women, with a clear indicator if you are a Department of Health or Education or South African Police Service, how are you translating this? In the end, you are measured by it. So if you look back when this was actually made to be compulsory, the picture actually started changing. I am sad to say, though, Chairperson, that over the years, the structures that were put in place, even at a departmental level, whether it was committees or gender focal points, where there were gender focal points, people tended to be junior, such that they were not even sitting in excos to make sure that this happened. Where there were no gender focal points, there were gender forums or gender committees. So over years in our monitoring, we've realized actually that this has not had the meaningful impact that it was intended. But as a way of creating an enabling environment of making sure that each and every government department takes responsibility, government departments were encouraged through this framework to integrate these principles in their developmental plan to ensure that progress towards women's empowerment and gender equality happen. Sadly, over time, it has become more or less a compliant thing rather than something that engenders a kind of culture that has a meaningful impact. Let me just give you an example. For example, you hardly find any department that is able, say if there are workshops, let's say in the workshop invitation to the department, you say, what are the needs of women in that department for them to participate effectively? You don't even see something that says, will there be a need for childcare, for example? So much as we are putting this as one of the mechanisms that formed an enabling environment, in real life, it is a long way to having a meaningful impact that it was intended. The moral of pointing this, Chairperson, perhaps in this review, what would be very important is to look at the assumptions we made at the beginning in the Women's Charter of the kind of structures that should be in place to enable effective equality. What road have we traveled? Where are we now? What lessons have we learned out of that? And what are the success stories that need to be carried forward? And what are the gaps? Next slide, please. I will be a bit faster now. Some of the challenges, of course, as I indicated earlier, is that some of the professions are historically male-dominated in other professions. So you'll find that it is actually quite a road for women to participate in meaningfully because of those historic facts. Some of the issues are around issues of compliance with employment equity, where it's done as a tick box, rather than once the women are there at entry or middle level, they are provided with meaningful support, whether it's training, of making sure that they really make a meaningful impact. and so those have been really challenges. But even at the level of representation, you will see that there's a certain degree of fluctuation that you will see just now as I share some of the information. Next slide, please. I'll be a bit faster now. Some of the challenges, for example, are around competition for skills of the private sector. Find that you recruit these women, they are happening, they are rising, but very quickly they see other opportunities in the private sector. Many of them also around the budget constraint and the constant restructuring in the departments, which actually makes budget for budget cuts and the certain moratoria in filling positions. So it's quite easy then that the progress that you've been making just doesn't get made. And there are other factors, of course, like lack of structured support for both men and women in the public service to understand that this representation is not just about number crunching. It's about the value of bringing all sectors of society in a work environment, which then makes it much, much, much more possible for everyone to contribute to the betterment of society, especially in the developmental, in building the developmental state that we aspire. Next slide. What interventions then have we put in place us as in the public service? The following interventions really are informed by the implementation of the 8 principles for women empowerment and gender equality. In some of the departments, these directorates were located in the DGs and Chief Operations Officer offices, and in others were dedicated and in teams, as I said previously. But we have a responsibility to monitor and evaluate the organization of the public service. So we've actually made some of the firm recommendations around where there ought to be areas of improvement, such as ring fencing some of the positions so that you are quite upfront that in certain areas you are targeting for women only to occupy those positions. Next slide. I'm about to finish, Chairperson. There are challenges when it relates to giving effective capacity, especially at middle level, in terms of the resource constraint and making sure that people actually get bursaries and just those conscious programs of ensuring that targeted development initiatives are there for women. Next slide. In terms of the role of the public service, ensuring that it helps to foster a healthy working environment for women, over and above integrating these 8 values, we've actually got into a drive as the PSC to really go back to the drawing board around the constitutional values and principles. I know that there was once this drive, which was particularly to highlight the issues of Batupile principles, which was informing the entire public service to say, you must actually put people first in everything that you do. But if you look at the constitutional values and principles as they are articulated in section 195, even if you don't do anything else, any other intervention in our space, if we realize that if you could just get everyone to understand that whatever we do in the public service, you treat people with dignity. Let me just step back for a moment. If you just remember the former Deputy Chief Justice in looking at the issues, the unfortunate incidents of Gauteng Health that happened. You know, he kept on asking the question, how did you do this when the values and principles in Section 195 were so clear that you really possibly can't treat somebody with a disability like this? How did you get somebody on an open van when you knew that you would be trampling on their human dignity? Now, one of the key interventions that we are driving to foster a healthy working relationship for men and women in the public service is really this drive of promoting the values and principles in the public service, treating people with dignity, being responsive, making sure that the primacy of doing everything legally is what drives people, making sure that the workplace is represented by people with disability, men and women, and make sure that there is a regional, urban, rural representation. So we can talk about concepts such as how do you deal with toxic masculinity. Even that, when there are incidents that we even describe in those terms, it's because somebody has ignored the values and principles that underpin what we do in the public service. So, honorable members, if even anyone who comes before this august house, whether they've come to present a budget or they've come to do whatever report, if we could all just say, before you tell us anything else, can that first slide be about how you in department so and so make sure that each and every one of the officials in your department understand the constitutional imperatives as they are in Chapter 2 of the Constitution and in Section 195 of the Constitution, and how every day the work they do is done in accordance with that. All of these issues that we're talking about, they will actually fall in line. So we do all of this, and we're doing this drive in the hope that all of else that are challenges, whether it's gender transformation, it's really wiping the floor if we do not fix the roof of a values-driven public service. Next slide. The public service offers a transparent and equitable remuneration system for its employees. So on the issues of gender parity, if you are applying for a job for a chief director or a DGG or a deputy director, there are regulated salary scales. It's not possible to discriminate on the basis of gender. But that doesn't mean that we should take that off on our radar, because there are many nuances that creep in, which still make it possible for women to fall a little bit behind. Remember, women have other responsibilities in society, like giving birth. So that six months of a woman taking a step back from the profession and having to come back later, even if they entered at the same time with the same salary level, might quite easily, when it comes to issues such as bonuses and all of that, without being really obvious that that's making them lag behind. If it's not monitored, it can slip quite easily. So as much as government is expected to champion transformation and serve as an exemplary employer in many areas, including gender representativity, the public service is still lagging behind in ensuring that women representativity at other levels is in line with the set targets in some other sectors. For example, in education, in health, most of the educators in the education space are women. But if you look at who the principals are, the majority of them are men. Therefore, there is a need still for a concerted effort to address the underrepresentation of female employees, especially at SMS level, and the success in the end for the country to realize the extent to which gender power relations are ended should be led by an exemplary government practice.